but I am looking forward to the discussion today about the freedom of speech and some of the challenges of technology, or just the way that technology changes things for us. So, as a overview, this one will be a lot more discussion than last time, so hopefully you are ready to share a few things. We really encourage opposing viewpoints, thoughts, opinions. We don't appreciate any type of name calling or putting others down. And so we want it to be respectful and civil, and then trying to take turns as we talk. And potentially we may need to move on from a point. And so if it's time to move on, then let's just move on and come back to it later if we need to. We do these Constitution courses because we do believe strongly in the power of knowledge. Last time we shared a little bit about how politicians can manipulate us when we don't understand things. James Madison said, "Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives." And I think in our country we're trying to be our own governors. That's one of the goals of it, is to be somewhat self-governed. And so there is power that comes with having knowledge and understanding and what's taking place and why it's taking place. This is an overview of at least how I approach the law and how I see liberty and freedom. And so it's to give you an idea, because one of the big things we talk about in these constitutional discussions is the role of morality in constitutional interpretation. And if you look at this, and if you see this, anarchy is a state of no law, generally. It's a state where the most powerful person wins, just the person with the most muscle, most might, whatever. Tyranny, I like to define as a state of all law. The law decides everything for you. You have no decisions for yourself. And that could happen through a dictator that just can issue whatever ruling they want or create whatever rules they want. But to me, liberty, the state of liberty, is somewhere between those two extremes. It takes laws to pull us out of anarchy, but it takes morality and personal responsibility to keep us from tyranny. If we shirk all morality and we shirk all personal responsibility, we head towards tyranny. And so I like to view liberty as this balance where we put enough laws in place necessary to get us out of anarchy, but we as individuals choose to govern ourselves in morality, and we focus on private solutions in those areas as opposed to looking to the law to save us. So as we talk about things today, keep this in mind about looking at which side of the balance we're on. Because laws, if there's too many laws, we're moving towards tyranny. If there's not enough, we're in more of a state of anarchy. And if we're structured it right, we have liberty. So the First Amendment we're focusing on, there's so much to talk about in the First Amendment. I love talking about a lot of the issues here. But it says, for our purposes today, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And so there's obviously some other things in there, but we're looking at the freedom of speech and of the press. So what do you think it means to abridge freedom, or abridge the freedom of speech? What does the term abridge mean in this context?
Like a bridge around it, I guess, bridge over it.
Okay, so maybe it's talking about an actual physical type bridge, or something that creates a bridge over it, around it. Any other thoughts on what it might mean to abridge? And because it says they shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, it doesn't say they shall make no law that prohibits speech. And when courts look at language, they like to say that every word matters. It means something. And so generally, to abridge something is to make it shorter or condense it. If you're going to abridge something in writing, a book, it becomes more condensed or shorter. And so, at least when I read this, I see it saying, Congress shall make no law respecting, or shall make no law abridging or shortening the freedom of speech. But if we come from the perspective of freedom or liberty being at the center up here, then, and if you look at that language about abridging, it's saying don't shorten this, don't pull it to one side or the other. But perhaps it's saying there may be room for some regulation. Because even when the Constitution was passed, they had laws, for example, that you couldn't defame somebody. And so you couldn't say whatever you wanted. There were laws in place, there were restrictions in place, because they felt it necessary to say we have to have something to create a state of freedom or liberty. And it's one of the things that the courts have looked at, is to say, well, the founders didn't intend for there to be absolutely no regulation whatsoever on speech, because there were some restrictions in place at the time when this was passed. So then the question becomes, how do we determine what's appropriate and what's not? But again, in looking at that, if you look at the term abridging the freedom of speech, it is different language than the one used with the free exercise of religion. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof of religion. And so they could have said, Congress shall make no law prohibiting the freedom of speech. So whether or not they meant something different, that's up for debate, but it is something to know. So the case that we're going to go through today, I think it's a pretty fun case. Well, it wouldn't have been fun to be the guy, but Charles, our good friend Charles, was a socialist. And this was during the time of what they called the Red Scare in American history, during World War I. So World War I era, we have socialism, communism, these other forces coming on the scene, and America is very concerned about it. And we see this time, they were trying to root out, politicians who might be friendly to it, whatnot. There was a lot taking place in American society associated with this. And one important thing to know as we talk about freedom of speech, in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson established the Committee on Public Information to circulate and distribute anti-German and pro-Allied propaganda. So the government said, we are going to go try and convince people that Germany's bad and the Allies are good. So, do any of you have any concerns off the top of your head when you hear the government was created committees to try and push certain propaganda one way or the other? Is that a concern immediately to anyone?
Well, it's manipulation, for sure.
Okay, so is it manipulation in and of itself for them to put out information? Because at what point do we cross into manipulation with information?
My concern would be the bias. If it's presented both sides evenly, I'm fine with that, but if there's a bias, then
Okay. And why would we be concerned if the government's biased?
they're trying to get me to think one way or to think their way or whatever.
And what generally does that make us think? If the government's trying to make me think a certain way,
Something's big time wrong.
Encourage tyranny.
that they have some agenda, that they're moving one way that maybe I don't want them to go. And maybe they have pure hearts and they're not trying to do that, but I think in general as people, we start to think those things, that there could be some agenda behind it when they have a goal educating me a certain way or getting me to think a certain way. So all of this is taking place, and Charles is the General Secretary of the Executive Committee of the Socialist Party. They decide that they're very opposed to the military draft taking place. So World War I, the U.S. instituted the draft again. They called it the conscription bill at the time. And he said, the socialists say, hey, wait a minute. He said, we passed the 13th Amendment after the Civil War, and there was this new prohibition that says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. And they said the draft is definitely a form of involuntary servitude. I actually think it's a very sincere constitutional argument to make. I'm curious what you guys think. If you were a judge and they came in and said, hey, we passed a new amendment. You can't force me to go to war. That's involuntary servitude. What would you say?
I'd say it's a strong argument.
Yeah, I think it's a strong argument too. Would you be inclined to say, yep, Constitution says that, or would you kind of go, oh, maybe I need to figure out a way to not let them win?
Well, the government say, it's not service because we'll pay you.
Okay, so maybe they say, oh, we'll pay you, so we can make you work if we pay you.
Still has that word involuntary.
And maybe servitude, to your point, maybe servitude means you're not paid. But I think servants were generally paid and slaves weren't. But I like it. I like the thought there. I don't know. Do you guys know if the soldiers were paid during World War I? I have no idea.
I think they were.
I think they had some paid, not a lot, but some.
Something. So, but they're pretty serious about it. And for one, they don't like the war because America's fighting socialism, communism, a lot of these movements taking place. And so, for sure, they may have an agenda as well of not wanting the draft to take place. But so the government's over here on the one hand, printing and distributing information that's anti-Germany and pro-Allied forces. And so they say, well, we're going to do it too. We have 15,000 leaflets we print, and we're going to go share them with America. So when they do this, this is their, this is the front page of their leaflet. I don't know how well you can see it, but it says, "Long live the Constitution of the United States. Wake up, America. Your liberties are in danger." They quote the 13th Amendment. And then they go through and talk about some of the things. They say the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, quoted above, embodies a sacred idea. The Socialist Party says that this idea is violated by the Conscription Act. When you conscript a man and compel him to go abroad and fight against his will, you violate the most sacred right of personal liberty and substitute for it what Daniel Webster called despotism in its worst form. A conscript is little better than a convict. He is deprived of his liberty and of his right to think and act as a free man. A conscripted citizen is forced to surrender his right as a citizen and become a subject. He is forced into involuntary servitude. He is deprived of the protection given him by the Constitution of the United States. He is deprived of all freedom of conscience and being forced to kill against his will. So they go through and actually say that this war is serving the interests of Wall Street, is one of the things that they claim in here.
Well, that hasn't changed.
And so they come back, and on the back it says, assert your rights. It says Congress isn't supposed to prohibit the free exercise of religion. One reason they say that is because they say if you are conscientiously opposed to war, if you believe in the commandment, thou shalt not kill, then that is your religion, and you shall not be prohibited from the free exercise thereof. And during this time, they actually call out that the Quakers were exempted from the draft due to their religion.
Remember that, yeah.
And he says, that's not fair. That's not equal protection. My religion says thou shalt not kill. I don't want to go to war. And you need to exempt me too. But they didn't. At the time, the government didn't. And so, again, when I read this, he goes through, he talks about how you're responsible. You must do your share to maintain, support, and uphold the rights of the people of this country. In this world crisis, where do you stand? Are you with the forces of liberty and light, or war and darkness? I think I actually put these backwards. I think this is the front, because it says over. But he talks in here about the socialist position. And he says, he did say in it, he says, do everything you can to fight against conscription. He says, go try and get the bill repealed. Go try and do things peaceably to not get drafted. And that was the extent of what they did. There was no violence associated with what they did, no calls to violence associated with what they did. But they were telling people to fight the draft and not get drafted. So, in the same time as this is taking place, and the government passes its committee to educate America on Germany and the Allied forces, the government also passes two acts. One's called the Espionage Act of 1917, and then the Sedition Act of 1918. The Espionage Act says that it was illegal to interfere with the operation or success of the armed forces of the United States or to promote its enemy's success. And it was illegal to cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, refusal of duty, or to willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the United States. And so, and then in addition, the postmaster could refuse to send things through the mail that might do any of these things. So, good old Charles, the government comes after him and says, you are interfering with recruitment. And so you can face up to 20 years in prison because of your pamphlet here. And then in addition, so, and just, Charles was tried under the Espionage Act we just looked at. We'll look at this next one in a second, but the Sedition Act that was passed in 1918 made it illegal to incite disloyalty, use in speech or written form any language that was disloyal to the government, the Constitution, the military, or the flag. And it was also illegal to advocate strikes on labor production or promote principles that were in violation of the act. So just, kind of gut check. Does it feel constitutional to you, in accordance with the First Amendment, for the government to ban speech or written, anything in speech or written, that was disloyal to the government, the Constitution, the military, or the flag? Does anyone think it should be allowed for them to ban that during this time?
No.
So it's a world war, it's a scary time, and Congress acts and passes that. So Charles, they come prosecute him. He's convicted. He's found guilty of interfering with the draft, and he gets sentenced to prison for quite a while. He appeals his conviction to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court takes his case along with a few others during this time. And they have to decide if the First Amendment, freedom of speech protection, prohibits the government from putting these guys in jail for saying, don't go get drafted. 13th Amendment says you don't have to. Again, as an attorney, I think it's a pretty strong argument to make, a pretty valid argument. I don't think it's frivolous. I don't think it's out there on its face saying, yeah, the draft's involuntary servitude. We expanded that after the Civil War. So from my perspective, it's a pretty decent argument. He didn't advocate for violence or other things. But curious what your thoughts are. Do you think it would be dangerous to America at this time to allow them to circulate these flyers?
I think that's the key to it, is it is dangerous. We don't allow people to yell fire in theater, cause a mass panic. There are certain things we don't allow people to say. You're making me really think here. You're putting this out and going, wow. The guy was just trying to do what he believed, that in a time of war, when you're concerned with what's going to happen to your existence, there's other things to think about, I guess.
Okay. And I think that's a very, very great things to look at, to say, does time of war justify, does that balance shift slightly during times of war?
Yeah, it's hard because I know my first reaction is even with the draft of yeah, if you're gonna live in this country, that's something that comes with it. You can get drafted because we have to defend our country. It's part of living in it. But then I think of, I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of how much power the government used with COVID, because to them, it was this danger, right? And that's what it was presented, why they had this power to do that. And so, in a similar way, I look at it of some things that I think are dangerous. It's like, yeah, you need to have this power to do that, but it's like, but if I don't agree that it's the same type of danger, then I don't want the government to have that kind of power. And so I'm trying to think of, yeah, you know, is it something in wartime, or is there a way to set up something that you can fall back on a principle, but yeah, it feels kind of, you know, I know how I feel, but I don't know if I want the government to have the power to determine that.
Yeah. And one question with that is, during World War I, was American soil attacked? And so what level of danger are we talking about with the war? We chose to go to a war in another land, but think of Vietnam, when people are getting drafted, going over, and people are saying, look, this isn't our war, we don't have to be there.
Well, it depends where the battlefront is, I guess. The front in Vietnam was perhaps a political one, so that became really sticky then.
Yeah.
How do you approach that? They weren't marching into New York, like you said, and Washington. They were calling across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
So you never have to draft or not.
Yeah, and it's one of the questions is, you know, is it as compelling? Because certainly if we're getting invaded, I think we're probably going to justify a lot more things to defend ourselves if there's troops on American soil. But these wars, most wars America's been involved in, with the exception of Pearl Harbor, we're going to fight somewhere else, right? Proactively.
I think you have potential though, you know, if you sit back and wait till the whole world's conquered and then you're the only one left to, you know, I mean, I remember my dad was in World War II and he always said, I'd rather send my sons to fight in another country than have the war come here. You know, he says it's such a devastating thing, and I guess it was sort of thing from it escalating to where it came here. I don't know. Plus, we had allies that we were supporting.
Yeah.
It's you know, it's like Matt was saying. It's, you know, how do you feel about it? I guess more than anything, is there some kind of rule you can create? I don't know.
Yeah, and it's one of the things the socialists for sure felt fine about those powers expanding and moving forward, because that was part of what they were promoting and looking for. They wanted things like that to expand. So to Matt's point, it wasn't anywhere near as dangerous to them as it might be. And certainly America has taken the position that if we're not proactive, we'll be next. And I think there is some truth to that in some areas. But again, how do we measure that? You know, people say that with Russia. If we allow Russia to take over Ukraine, it'll just be the next country, then the next country, and then eventually the battlefront will be here. So far, America hasn't fully gone in. They've given, you know, arms and money, but not troops yet. So all this is cooking, but I think one of the big things to remember about this time is, in general, people were incredibly afraid of socialism and communism. It was kind of at a heightened level where, similar to COVID, people would probably be just as afraid of socialism or communism as they were afraid of COVID, from what I can gather of history. And so the Supreme Court, in going through, it was actually a pretty short case. There wasn't a lot of discussion from the Supreme Court on this one. And the Supreme Court goes through and they say, look, they said the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. So I think what the Supreme Court's doing, if we go back here, the Supreme Court is looking at the balance here. And they're saying there has to be some law to create freedom, a state of freedom. There has to be some restriction somewhere. Because if you can just go in a theater and everyone yells fire and laughs as people get trampled to death, I say that's anarchy. For freedom to exist, there has to be some basic rule. And I think what the Supreme Court is articulating is their opinion that freedom of speech doesn't mean anarchy of speech, that there can be rules in place to set forth a workable framework in which humans can interact with speech. And so they go on to say, the question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. To me, that sounds a lot like they're talking about morality. They're saying, look, if Congress has the right to stop an evil from happening, we can ban words that will cause the same evil. So what do you think about that? And they also go on to say, when a nation is at war, many things that might be said in time of peace are such a hindrance to its effort that their utterance will not be endured so long as men fight, and that no court should regard them as protected by any constitutional right. So they certainly put in this place to say, well, first, Congress can prohibit things, can prohibit speech that's going to cause someone to do something that they have the right to prevent anyways. Yeah. If they have the power to outlaw something, they're saying if the speech is clearly and presently dangerous enough to bring about one of these evils, we can outlaw in a speech.
I guess that goes back to who thinks it's evil and who thinks, I mean, how do we as a people, if our government goes to the point where they're starting to say things are evil that we don't believe are evil, and if we can't speak against it because Congress thinks it's evil, how do we do it?
Yeah, and so it's a great question. Once something's been outlawed, do we lose the ability to speak about it? You know, what does that look like once Congress has outlawed something? So for example, let's say that they say it's illegal to kill someone, and if I say, oh, you should go kill that person, currently I can go to jail for that. That's one of the evils that I can't advocate for. Could I go, though, potentially, and be very careful in my wording, and go up to the legislature and say, I believe we should change the laws on murder? I think I would still be able to have a change of laws. But I couldn't advocate and push someone to go kill somebody else. But again, if you look back at the pamphlet that Charles had, he said in there, go try and change the laws. He did also say, and do everything drafted. But again, it's a funny thing because that one has a very strong, he's standing up for what he asserts as a constitutional right. Which to me feels a little different than just, oh, go kill somebody. But the court didn't see it that way. They just said, look, this is war. We're fighting these people. Guys are dying. I'm not going to give you the right to go not to get conscripted during this time. And so also, if you think about it, I mean, you kind of know how the constitutional challenge shakes out. But if you get this kind of case saying, oh, you can't even talk about that argument, that constitutional argument, how do you think it did in court? Didn't do so well. They still found a way to say that conscription and military duty was not part of the 13th Amendment. But you can see here the court is signaling kind of that they're not very open to that argument because there's a morality involved. There's people dying. And so they're saying, yeah, no, the Constitution doesn't prevent us from keeping guys alive and doing other things that we determine are important and moral.
So did they rule that just in times of war you can't try to encourage people not to, or to go against the draft, or just ever?
So the Espionage Act of 1917 is still in effect today.
So it's not just in times of war you can't advocate to be anti-draft.
Yeah, it's still in effect. This wasn't, the act wasn't based in times of war or not. And you can't do things to interfere with recruitment, military recruitment.
Cause that could make some sense, you know, in a time of war, we don't have time to go through this, it's happening right now kind of
Yeah.
thing, but in a time of peace, it's interesting to say that you can't, like, that's unconstitutional to do that.
And obviously it's a little, because if there is no draft in place and you're advocating against the draft, you're not interfering with anything.
So the
If
draft
there's,
is,
assuming there's not a war at the time, you're not interfering, and then you're not breaking the law, 'cause you're not interfering, because there's no draft.
but that would be kind of the thinking ahead kind of a thing.
Yeah,
Assuming there's a draft coming up, future to war, we're gonna go make a change kind of thing.
yeah. But again, you have to be, based on the Espionage Act being in place, you have to be pretty careful about it and what you're gonna do with it. So, this case, there's another guy, this guy's convicted under the Sedition Act. If you remember, that was the one that was even further, that said you can't even say anything bad about the government, the war, the flag, the military. And Abrams, along with 4 Russians, so I think there were 4 Russians that had come over. They didn't want America involved in the war at this time. And so he had leaflets that they printed and distributed, and they called for workers to strike in an effort to end military involvement in the Soviet Union. So he wanted workers to go on strike to show that they didn't want war in the Soviet Union. That was a specific part of the Sedition Act which said you can't advocate for labor strikes. And so he was sent to jail as well. And
Is this about the same time period?
yeah, this is the exact same time period. His case was just shortly after Charles' case.
What year?
This is 1919, we're talking about, World War I era. And so he goes to jail. He says, hey, I was just speaking. I have freedom of speech. And they said, no. They said, a clear and present danger. And the clear and present danger precedent stayed in place until 1969, half a century, until the Supreme Court eventually said, we're capturing too much political conduct in this, we need to have it more narrow. The test is too broad. And so in the case of Brandenburg v. Ohio, they overturned it. So they overturned the Charles Schenck case, the Jacob Abrams case. And they said that you could only go to jail for speech that is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. So it wasn't just the danger of it, it's that it's so clear it's going to happen. So currently, with a lot that's going on with President Trump and things he said, especially in relation to January 6th, this is one of the big debates. Did Trump say things that was directed to incite or produce imminent lawless action and was likely to do so? They're looking at that. If he were under the clear and present danger test, he'd probably be guilty. That's a pretty broad test to say that it was, pretty broad there. So just a couple little facts about the Espionage Act before we dive into the discussion portion. This one we talked about, it's still in effect. I don't know if you recognize any of these names, but people have been prosecuted under this Espionage Act. And some of them have tried to make constitutional First Amendment type challenges to their convictions or prosecutions. Not all of them have been fully prosecuted yet because some of them are in other countries. But Edward Snowden, he released a lot of NSA documents. WikiLeaks founder, Julian, I think he just, if I remember right, just got extradited from England. He had been hiding in an embassy in England not hiding, but he was taking security in an embassy in England for, I don't remember how long, 7, 10 years, something like that. Just lived in this one building. But he left it one day and they got him. They've been watching him for years and years. And then President Trump is also, they're trying to come after him, or part of the impeachment proceedings were based on him violating the Espionage Act or claims of it. So That one's still there. The Sedition Act has been repealed since. That one's not in effect at the moment. But during World War I, over 2,000 people were prosecuted under these two acts, and over 1,000 of them sent to jail.
These generally jury trials, or were they not jury?
I don't know the answer, but I know that the two we spoke about were jury trials. And so the jury convicted them and found them guilty. Juries, though, are instructed. They don't get to hear the constitutional arguments. Juries are just told, this is the law, did his conduct violate it, and they come back and say, yep. And it's up to the judges to decide if that's constitutional or not. Juries have to be informed enough to know it's not constitutional and then just decide on their own to not hold them guilty. But they don't, the constitutional arguments don't get presented to the jury in cases. Because the jury is not allowed to decide the law, they decide the facts. That's what they do. But 1,000 people, think about that. So kind of, if you relate this to COVID, can you imagine 1,000 people going to jail for what they said about COVID?
Is this the Red Scare period?
This is the Red Scare period. Yeah.
And then how does the whistleblower acts work with the espionage? Is that an escape clause? You can get out of the Espionage Act if you're a whistleblower and it's proven true or something?
No, so the whistleblowers we just looked at, they were actually, the Espionage Act was used to say that what they did was illegal.
To whistleblow?
To whistleblow, because they had national secrets that interfered with military operations. And so it was considered to be a form of spying, essentially, to release these, because it interfered with American military operations.
So I thought I heard you say the Espionage Act had been repealed, but then it says it's still in force today.
So it was the Sedition Act that was
The
repealed.
Sedition Act was
Yeah,
repealed.
that one was repealed. And so the Espionage Act is still around now. And it says you can't interfere with his military operations. And so by whistleblowing, they were determined to have done that. So yes, there is not an exception for whistleblowing. And one really interesting fact about this, there's this guy named Eugene V. Debs. He was the president of the Socialist Party. He also had a case. He was put in jail. He appealed to the Supreme Court, same as these other guys, upheld under the same standard. And so he's sitting in jail in 1920. Presidential election comes up. And I put this in because we may have a repeat of this, possibly, with the way things are going. He runs for president from jail. And this is before the internet. So it doesn't have the internet to put out. And he's allowed to put out one flyer a week from his jail cell. He gets his one flyer out, his supporters go copy it, spread it around the country. And he gets 910,000 votes from his jail cell. 3.4% of the overall votes in America at the time. And so you can see there was some support, certainly for the socialists at the time. But interestingly, we talked last time about the Supreme Court said we're the only ones that can make sure Congress doesn't go rampant on things. But the next two presidents that came in said, this is crazy, we put these people in jail, this isn't right. They released every one of them. Over the course of their presidencies, released every one of these people from jail that had...
Pardon them?
Yeah, because it was all federal prosecutions. And so the president let them all out. So it was interesting to see the president have a check on the, he was a check and balance at the time on the Constitution and constitutionality. He went to the Supreme Court, they didn't take it up, but the presidents did. So to go into the discussion side and kind of digital, I like to frame things in that light, to talk about how America has treated freedom of speech during periods of what's determined to be a crisis, a threat, a danger. And right now, there's this claim circulating in society that misinformation is producing an intense crisis. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think there's a problem with misinformation? and this can be something that you can fill, you know, it doesn't have to disclose the political view. Do you feel that there's a lot of misinformation out, people buy into it?
Well, I feel like as they change from news station to news station, I'm getting different stories.
Okay,
I think it's a challenge, you know, to really know who's telling them like it is, or is it their opinion, or like.
okay. So yeah, just listening to news, it's quite different. I know just looking at headlines about President Trump right now with all his trials, there'll be some that say, oh, he's the biggest idiot on the stand, and others that say he's amazing. Yeah, who knows?
I think the new misinformation is also coming from, from our universities.
Okay.
And from students that are educated, but, or especially, I've just been shocked. I was at a dinner with a Lebanese-born, very educated Muslim, and I have very dear friends that are Muslim that I adore, but very much the propaganda she adamantly spoke was incorrect. It was misinformation. But even though we were at a table with highly academic people, no one challenged that misinformation out of kindness. And it's not kind to not speak truth, right? To say, oh, that's an interesting perspective, I don't agree with you. We have to be stronger at saying when things are spoken that are not true. I think we've grown up being courteous, and that you can be courteous and still say, that's an interesting point of view, I don't agree. I don't know if that, I don't want to go all to the specifics, but it's obviously about Israel and Hamas, and it wasn't true what was said, but it was shocked me to almost the point of I didn't even know how to respond, because it amazed me that someone who had been since 8 years old had been given the freedom of liberty did not see liberty. Was very misinformed.
Well, there's some people that believe that liberty has caused all kinds of problems, right? When we say, why are there people say, oh, it's because you free and choose how to use their money and they don't help those that are in need. And so people can make arguments about things for sure. But this is where it gets interesting, asking, well, what really is misinformation? People can make arguments. Did you have your hand up?
Well, I just want to say is that I think that misinformation is like a big crisis, but the thing to like understand about misinformation is that like everyone has different opinions, and so if you were like going somewhere and you're like asking something like, how many times should I exercise a day or something, some people will say, oh, you should exercise all day, other people will be like, only 30 minutes, and you'd be like, well, you're telling me misinformation because it's not correct to exercise for 12 hours a day or something, but then it's like, but that's just your opinion. And
That's
so
a real
I think,
problem, deciding where it's misinformation.
yeah, because it's also just people's opinions of like, well, my opinion is this, and then you could be like, your opinion is misinformation, so like, you're misleading.
And when does an opinion become stated as fact?
Yeah.
Right? And a lot of people state their opinion as fact. And I think we have to definitely say, that's an interesting opinion. Like, I love what you're saying, reframe it. That is a great opinion. This is another side I've heard, right?
Well, it is one of the problems, though, is I've thought about it a lot to say, why is it that opinions and facts, the lines become so blurred? But I think one reason is because in our language itself is subjective. If you had to define what does cold mean, what is cold?
Absence of heat.
So it's the absence of heat. We're defining it in relation to something else, right? But if I walk outside and say, whoa, it's cold out here, is that a fact? Is that an opinion? What is that at that point? Because cold itself can only be understood in relation to something else.
If you're from Alaska, it's one thing. If you're from Arizona, it's a different.
It's very different, right? But it's part of this human experience too, is that so much of our experience in life can only be understood through what it isn't, or through its opposite. What is bad? Well, it's something that's not good, right? And so when we're talking and discussing things, I thought, what is it that's actual fact then? What's fact? Can I ever say that, ooh, it's cold, and that be a fact?
You can do that if you set up a frame of reference. If you say if it's under 32 degrees, then it's cold. If it's over 42 or whatever the reference is, right?
So if,
Then you can
assuming that we
measure
make a
that.
definition,
Right, as long as you have a frame of reference, then if you measure with respect to that, it's over, above, or it's equal, then it's
my reference, what is what? What is cold? What is hot?
right, and that's what we rely on government to do, because they set up the weights and measures, and that's how we know what time it is, and that's how we know how much a gallon of gas is, and a gallon of milk, and whatnot, right? That's all
Yep.
based on that.
Yep.
And I guess maybe there's more, but I see two different situations. You have facts that can be proved through science, mathematics, physics. Those kind of facts, if you do this, then this happens. And then you have your morality facts, so to quote facts that you talked about. We have morality decisions we have to make to keep being from tyrannical or anarchy. Those laws come into place, but to have too many laws, we have to have morality involved there. And so that becomes more subjective.
Yeah, and it does. But going back real quick to this point about the point of reference, if there's a law that says cold is anything under 32 degrees, or cold is when water freezes, or whatever they want to say, and then there's other laws that say, okay, when things are cold, this is the speed limit. How would you change all of those laws with just changing one little change to the law? You would just create a new definition in the law and say, oh, cold really means 50 degrees or 10 degrees. And suddenly all the laws that rely on that same definition and that point of reference have now changed. So why is it that definitions are why is there so much battle over definitions in our society today?
Exactly what you just said.
It changes the whole framework of other things. And we have to stop and think, this is one of the points that I'll push always, is when you hear that society is trying to change a definition, you have to start to trace it through and say, what is this going to change? What is the push? Because law, language only exists in relation to others, and we have to create the bounds. The bounds are the place that we change everything associated with it. And so when we talk about family and defining family, when we talk about men and women and the definition of woman or man, and those changes take place, there's an incredible shift happening. And when I see things, even so, the news recently, I always watch. It's pretty fascinating how all of the news sources, liberal or conservative, at the same time will start using new terminology. It's pretty crazy to me. The one I've seen most recently is they no longer call people homeless. You know what the new term for homeless is?
Displaced.
It's not displaced.
Unhoused.
Unhoused. What's the difference just in even the implicit assertion about responsibility from homeless to unhoused?
The unhoused is the government's fault, us.
It's us,
We
right?
did it to them.
We did it to them. We didn't give them a house, they're unhoused.
I heard one today.
Or they say experiencing homelessness, so it happened to them, something
Yeah.
that came to.
And that is when they say experiencing homelessness.
The one I heard today was sensitive materials. So now the education committee is looking at sensitive materials, which are really pornographic materials. But if you say pornographic materials, you get a lot more attention and people on either side of it. But when you're saying sensitive materials, they can kind of maybe not attract the attention.
Yep. And it's just sensitive, which means just to be handled with care, right? But still handled, generally. And so these definitions, we can see some of them just create a different feeling inside of us, potentially. But some of the definitions actually change the whole framework for all the other things that follow from it. And so if you think about cold, and what is cold, our language has to have a framework and a point of reference. And some people understand this very well, and they will manipulate language. And it goes both ways. So the way that America got rid of, for the most part, the estate tax away, and the government used to take tons of your property when you passed away. Virtually no states impose an estate tax anymore. The federal government still does, but almost all states have repealed it. Because they changed the terminology from the estate tax to the death. People were very opposed to taxing people that died. They felt that was very unjust. But taxing an estate felt like you were taxing money and wealth and rich people and things. But that change in terminology was key to changing those laws. And again, that's a more feeling-based one. But they play both of those with definitions.
So with our respect to our freedoms, is it fair to say that the Constitution is our frame of reference that we've been operating under?
It is a frame of reference. And it has words that stay solid. So the words aren't changing the Constitution. But I believe, and I'm going to continue articulating this during each discussion, I believe there's always been two frames of reference that overlap. We have the Constitution and we have morality. And the Constitution has always been interpreted in light of morality, because even the words in the Constitution, what does the word abridge the freedom of speech mean? They're getting that meaning from morality. And that morality is informed by the stories of the time, the situations of the time, and all that as well.
Right, each court case is applying an interpretation of the terms of the Constitution.
Yep. And they have to go to a point of reference to say, what are these terms? What are their definitions?
But that can shift over time as morality of society changes.
Correct. And that's what's happening even here, where the court goes in the Schenck case and the Abrams case to 50 years later saying, oh, that was wrong. The morality has changed. And today, we look at these cases and go, wow, we don't feel that would pass today. It's changed. The society has changed quite a bit. So when we talk about misinformation again, going back to the definition thing, what is misinformation? Because if I can say, oh, I'm cold, what can the government do? If I can say, oh, 12 hours of exercise is healthy, is that a fact? Is it not?
So misinformation is sharing something that's untrue, at least to someone's perspective. But disinformation is sharing with the intent
you just say it to make it sound good for you. And how moral is that? And is that gonna change depending on what you're talking about?
Yep. So can any of you think of an example where something you would say, if someone said it, was clearly false? Are there things that we can just outright prove in this world? It's not really subject to opinion.
The world is flat. The sky is green.
We never went to the moon.
Okay, can we prove that? I can't prove that.
Well, I guess I personally can't prove it. There seems to be, well, you know, you have the same argument with, I've been to Japan, but maybe none of you have been to Japan, so just because I say it's there, how do you know it's there? Other than from information you've seen on a map, or, you know, you have to believe what other people have said. You know, how, I don't know, where do you get it?
Well, let's say that we've got, okay, you go ahead.
Well, it just reminded me a few years ago, I don't remember how long, there was someone who was going around claiming that the Holocaust hadn't happened, caused quite a stir, and I think he finally ended up having to be forced to admit that he was wrong to say that.
Yeah, so Germany has very strong laws. You're not allowed to allege the Holocaust didn't happen. You go to jail for it in Germany. But there still are people today that talk about the fact that the Holocaust didn't happen as articulated in history. But again, when we go kind of through and I'm just even trying to think of a simple example. Let's say that I told someone, oh, I was in Washington, D.C. tonight. That's probably something that we could prove I wasn't. You guys would all go in and testify. Maybe there's a camera that says, look, he was here, this is in Salt Lake City. And then maybe I go, oh, well, I call Salt Lake City, Washington, D.C. Right? But in general, we're going to go from a frame of reference. It's not just what I call it. I told other people. And so there are a few things that I think are pretty clear-cut. It just isn't that way. You know, 20 years ago, if I said I'm a woman, people would say, well, that's clearly false. Now that's being challenged and questioned. But that is part of what we have. There are some things I think that we can say clearly, nope, that wasn't the case. We can reconstruct certain things. You know, if you have cameras and they watch a car accident, most of that I don't think there's a lot of argument about generally when there's cameras and things involved. So there is some facts, but a lot of our life, I believe, is opinion or experience based. I believe a significant part of it is. So when we talk about misinformation and we ask, can the government ban misinformation?
My question is whether you're changing a definition here anyway. Should we be using the word propaganda rather than misinformation? Is there a difference?
That's a great question. I love it. I love the question. What do you guys think?
Well, it's going to be propaganda to some and not to others, which would be similar.
I think it comes down to what is agreed upon as primary sources, right? Like, is a video camera a primary, or and now with the technology being able to change that.
Yeah, the deep fake technology, right?
Right, so there's a lot of we as a community, as a whole, we have to agree on primary source documents and primary sources for fact. That's one of the places we don't agree, is what is a
What is
primary
even factual,
source.
right?
Yeah.
And why may we not agree on what's factual?
It's hard to trust people.
It's hard to trust people because we feel everyone has something they're trying to get from it, right? This is one of the problems, I believe, with capitalism, is at some point we know if someone's done a lot of work and created something, there's probably seeking money or power with it. That's just kind of one of the assumptions we have. I'm not saying it's entirely true, but we've been so inundated with people trying to buy our time or attention or get us to do something or believe something because they want something from us, that we kind of get this bias of someone's got to slant somewhere, right?
I've just been thinking about racist propaganda. It's interesting. You know, my wife has had this for 25 years, and you can get on the internet, and there's all kinds of things to cure your tinnitus, I would say, it in 25 minutes, 5 minutes, and do this one simple trick. And from our experience, none of that could be true. And yet, do those people believe that, or are they just after some money? You know, I mean, has it worked for somebody, and because it worked for somebody, it makes it so they can go out and say, oh, this was a miracle for me, let's do this for everybody. And sometimes it does work for somebody.
Yeah, because one of the things about healing and health is faith is an integral part of it. The placebo effect means faith has power in healing. That's what placebo really means. I'm just kidding. If someone believes it heals them, and you give them a sugar pill, there are people from that sugar pill. And so science has to account for the placebo effect in every trial it does, because people literally get healed from believing that something will heal them. And it does. So then it's this fascinating question, well, it worked for me. Why can't I say it will work for you?
And that other thing that you talked to me about that one day, about that device you plug into your house and it helps you save electricity. And
Is it
people
true?
get
I
that
saw the ad
testimony.
too.
Yeah, that one I went, there's got to be something fundamental about electricity. I don't understand if this thing's true, because this is not how electricity works, I don't think.
The other place we get that kind of force is with government funding. Government funding can sway things, even though it's quote scientific. You can go one way or the other, depending on where the money is coming from and what you have to write the paper to fit in so you can have more funding. It's very strong.
Yeah. No, it is very strong. If you go to the research and what professors are allowed to research, it's very much governed by who's willing to pay for it. And they have an agenda usually with it, something they want to show or accomplish or find. And so our research isn't pure in the sense of people just research purposes.
Some people do, but it's unusual.
Well, you have to have something independent of your own to do that, because generally you're relying on funding from someone. And so just saying the individual may have a pure heart, but they're still constrained by their funding sources for sure. So one thing with this is we talk about misinformation. Can the government ban it? Because they could say it's dangerous. Clear and present danger, right? People believe something false. Is it dangerous to believe something false?
Can be.
It can be. Is it all the time?
I think some things can be harmless.
Yeah, so some things can be harmless, some things can be dangerous.
And I think that's one of the problems with society today, is we've become dependent on the government telling us what can harm us and what can't harm us, so we don't have to think for ourselves. We figure, well, this wouldn't be allowed to be sold if it wasn't real, because it'd be against the law, because people are trying to, or because we expect the government to take care of anybody that's not doing what's right.
Yeah, do we read side effects on medication? Why not?
Too much work.
Too much work, you gotta sleep, but we have this overarching trust that the FDA wouldn't have approved it if it was really that dangerous.
Well, if the doctor gave it to you.
And the doctor gave it to you, right?
Then there's all these commercials, and you're like, I'm not gonna take that.
The people look so happy in them, though.
I know. And they're happy, but now they're cartoons. Because they can manipulate card better than they can a person, maybe.
So the last question on here, think about this. Why aren't we the most knowledgeable about truth when we live in a time that virtually all information is available over the internet? In the Bible, it actually prophesies of our day. It says, in that day, it says people will be ever learning but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth.
And that they will be carried away by every whim of doctrine.
Yeah, they'll be carried away by every whim of doctrine. So what's happening? What is it inherent in the human condition that makes truth so difficult to find?
One of the problems is there's a lot of noise.
Okay, so there's tons of noise.
And then there's opinions, and you have to distinguish between truth and error, and opinions and truth.
Tons of noise. So it takes a lot of time, right?
Yep, effort.
Takes time and effort. What else is happening that prevents us from finding truth?
I don't know if you're saying that, I just remember after President Biden came into office, and I'm not for or against in his comment, I'm just saying that the media actually were asked by the government to bring out more good things about President Biden, at least that was in the media. And it makes you feel like, depending upon who's in and who likes them and whatever, you're still getting this misinformation. So I'm just saying, to me, it adds to it.
Feels like propaganda, right? And it comes, and then it makes it difficult to trust.
It actually came out in the media that there was some big meetings and the media were asked to respond to things that were going on in a more positive light.
Yeah. And so then we start seeing people are seeking, they have an agenda. When we see that they have an agenda, it becomes hard to trust. So we have tons of noise. We have the agendas that make it tough to trust what we read. What takes place inside of us that makes the search for truth? How do we decide what we believe and what we don't believe? Because all of us have formed an opinion about something. With all the noise, even with all the agendas, we believe something. Where does that belief come from?
Sometimes we have an opportunity to see the results. If we're fortunate, we can actually see results and say, oh, that is a good path, and this is a good path. We don't always have the time to do that, unfortunately.
Yeah. And so there's certainly we can experience something, see if it worked or didn't work. But a lot of it, I don't have any idea about Israel and Hamas or Russia and Ukraine. I'm not there. I can't experience it. So then I'm reliant on something, and I'm still forming opinions about it and beliefs about it. But what's shaping those? What inside of me is shaping those?
Maybe we're raised, our environment, so we've had up to that point, the things we were taught by our families, by the schools we went to.
Trusted sources already.
Yeah,
People.
so we have that. We have trusted sources. Someone say something over here.
I said our morals or like values.
Our morals and values.
Paradigm.
What's that?
Paradigm.
So
So the person born in Palestine said, I am sure that the Israelis started the conflict and they pretended to bomb their own people so that then they could go into and attack Hamas. So of
Yeah.
course, and so, but when you're talking about proof, can you prove that they didn't, I mean, it's, to me, that sounds preposterous. And then, but could you actually tell them, I'm sure they didn't doctor any videos, videos can't be doctored. Because, you know, you go to the fact, have you seen the videos, have you seen what's happened? And then they're automatically saying, well, they've doctored those videos. So it was so amazing how someone could use their own frame of reference that was so contrary to my frame of reference to defend their point of view. Right?
And I saw this taking place, it's happening in both wars, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Hamas. In the Russia-Ukraine conflict war, when a hospital gets bombed, Russian media says Ukraine, it was a Ukraine missile. Ukraine media and Western media says it was a Russian missile. And you look at that, and then you even have situations where they have videos of soldiers, you know, killing people, killing civilians in the streets or whatever. And Russia says, those were Ukrainians that dressed up as Russians. They're just trying to make us look bad. And how in the world do you decide what you believe in that? It goes back to who we trust as credible. You know, Russia, we say Russia is manipulating all information and won't let out accurate info. Russia says the same about us. Do I know if the government's manipulating info?
So growing up, I was sitting on my dad's mom's front porch, and a bunch of my cousins were there, tons of them. And my grandmother whispered something in my ear, and then I was supposed to whisper it in somebody else's ear. And by the time it got around 20 of us or so, it was like not even what my grandmother had said. So maybe, I don't know, I mean, it takes time in our day to really go and look and see what is truth, and like, it's just exhausting.
It can feel exhausting, right? It can feel very exhausting.
Well, right now, the media doesn't seem to be able to decide if Putin is dead or alive. I mean, I just saw another one tonight.
When did this happen?
It's growing. I'm sorry, what?
Did Putin die?
It's been, no, we don't know. I mean, some.
There's
some sources say-
a
I
growing
don't
chorus
watch
of people
TV.
that say it's a double or a person with a mask or whatever, and Putin's really dead. I don't know.
However, well, and his successor supposedly used a reference to him in past tense. But I just want to say that I really appreciate the opportunity to study this, because I'm not saying anybody else, but myself, I feel deeply that I don't study it enough. I don't know what's going on, and then it would make a really big difference for me if it did. So I just really appreciate this.
I was just gonna say, in her comment made me think about the skill of communicating. I always hated to communicate with somebody in an email because I felt like they'd never read it. It always went back and I said, did you even read my email? So I wanted to call them and talk to them. So I have a conversation back and forth, so I'm making sure they understand what I'm trying to say, because I have to look at myself and say, maybe I don't communicate well. Maybe I don't write a good email.
The emotion is left out, you know, the tone does a lot, and, yeah.
And to your point of being knowledgeable and having knowledge, it's very important for all of us to be educated to the point that we can't communicate well. You read an article and then you go read the comments underneath the article and you look at some of those comments, you go, did you read the article? How are you saying this from what you read in the article? It doesn't make any sense to me, but I think it's really tough. Communication is a big part of all of this. Because some of that misinformation is people believing they read something and that it really wasn't there, but they believe it, so they pass it on.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're starting to get to the heart of what's really taking place. When we're searching for truth or knowledge, there's the human condition of, we have a belief, we want to validate it. And so once we've formed a belief about something, we seek validation of it. Capitalism knows this. And so people will put out all kinds of things that validate the way we feel, because they get clicks, they get likes, they get whatever associated with it. And it's why we see such a polarization in the news even. As we talk about the digital age with news, it used to be you had to get a newspaper, and the newspaper had to guess at what you would read. They just had to put all these stories together in a paper and hope that the conglomeration of them was enough to make you buy it again. But now, they don't have to conglomerate any stories together. They know exactly what you click on and exactly what you read. And if they put out a story of a dad that has been faithful to his wife for 40 years and goes to work every day, and a story of a dad that killed his wife and kids, the one that is the atrocious one is going to get clicked and read. It's going to get them the advertising revenue. And people are going to gloss over the one about the dad that was a good dad for. And so our nature starts to become, we seek sensationalized news, we seek shocking things, we're looking to be, find different things. But ultimately, we're all looking to validate our beliefs. We want to find truth, but we want those to go in accordance with our beliefs. So when someone says to a Palestinian, Israel launched the rockets, we accept it right away, right? And if someone says to us, if we don't want to believe that, no, that's made up, that's false news. Yep, it validates, and so instantly we start to judge what's true and not true by what validates our beliefs and say. the search for truth, the reason I think it's so difficult to search for truth is because if we're truly seeking truth, we're also seeking for it to somewhat inform our beliefs. And we have to become very open to say, maybe I don't know. And I need to learn what's true and have even some of our beliefs shaped along the way. And usually the search for truth requires that we change things about ourselves. But the human condition is we want to validate things about ourselves. And that's opposite to a true search for truth, which requires that we change things about ourselves.
And as we see all of this coming about, going down the slippery slope, there's a word that is far more prominent nowadays than it ever has been, and that the word is numb. People get so overwhelmed, they start to get numb.
Yep.
And that happens, maybe somebody that was on task with what was true now doubts themselves, and it's just, this is all a slippery slope.
Well, and we get numb from the noise, we get numb from how much work it is, the pain of being wrong, all these different things. It's an interesting condition of our existence.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say, is it's incredibly vulnerable to not know, especially in today's world. It's incredible how many times I see from both sides messages of, whether it's said this way or not, silence is violence. If you're not speaking up, then you're part of the problem. And it feels like, one, all the discussion is happening on social media. Like, in all my time on the internet, I've never seen this, even to mention Israel. I've never seen something so civil here, and maybe everyone here can agree, but, and maybe that's why, but just to say there's something here that maybe there's a feeling here that we can say, yeah, maybe we don't know and we need more information. You can't do that online. You can't go and say, well, I don't know, because then it feels like you'll just be shot down. And so it feels like every comment you have to make is a mic drop, that everything's buttoned up, that you've done every piece of research, that you can cite every piece so that no one can come after you for it, because they will. And so it's interesting you talk about that we have all this information, and yet it seems that our search for truth is more than ever, which I think there's a piece to that. We have relative truth more so, and it's not to say that people didn't manipulate then, but I think when there's a human-to-human interaction going on, that truth is able to transfer and spread even in a way that I don't think can happen without the human-to-human interaction.
Yeah, it's a great point. And one of the things to think about with technology, when we talk about freedom of speech in a digital age, if you're online, you're open to the whole world attacking you, right? If you're in a room like this, you can talk, you can discuss, you can go through things, kind of the bounds of what you're up against, and it makes for a very different experience, for sure.
Along with what he said, I do think there's lots of people trying to get people to speak up, but there's also a lot of silencing and cancel culture and the safe spaces where people want their feelings validated so much that they won't let the opposing opinions into their lives, it's just wrong, because then you can't let other theories and ideas, and you're just in one mindset your whole life, which is just horrible.
Yeah. But we're striving so much to validate something inside, right? It's under attack, we feel attacked, all these things are happening.
Just so those points, I listened to Jordan Peterson talk yesterday on this very subject. He was saying that there's really only there's a very small percentage of people online that are extremely narcissists, and they create an environment that's really ugly for a lot of people. But he says when his interactions with people personally, said he's gotten along with everybody he's ever interacted with personally. The only trouble he's ever had is when it's been something online where people can hide behind the anonymity of being online. So this person-to-person thing is very important, I think.
He's probably never dealt with attorneys then. He's gotten along with everyone.
I think it's I'm very uncomfortable, and maybe because I always come from an educating youth perspective, of us saying that we don't know, that we need to discover truth. There is so much truth that is foundational, and I would be so sad if I gave my children or my students the perception that truth is always debatable. You know, I think that when we get to that ethics level and we get to that level of determining, but I do believe we have enough, we can say whether or not we went to the moon. We can say what cold is. We may have to clarify and speak precisely so that we can communicate clearly, but I want my children and my grandchildren to be founded in the idea that knowledge is power and knowledge is attainable.
For
right?
sure.
Even though we come to this point of debating it at this academic level of maturity for adults, and to recognize that information is being manipulated and it is being, I feel like journalists now don't ask questions. They lead their position.
And why is that?
Because maybe it's that propaganda, that
Money.
capitalism.
It sells more,
They're-
right?
They're a business.
They know what they have to write, because the internet's shown them exactly what they have to write.
And it's also we've paid our secondary educational systems to produce this type of knowledge that is not true. So,
And it is-
I don't know.
No, and you have a great point. And I tried when I said it, I tried to say, we have to open up some degree to say
Yeah,
our beliefs have to be informed. I didn't say all the way,
right.
because there are foundational beliefs. One, if you want to find truth, you have to have a foundational belief that truth's discoverable, that it is attainable, right? If you don't even believe that, you're never going to find truth. And there are certain beliefs that absolutely have to be a part of our framework if we're even going to exist. And there are some very wise, profound people. C.S. Lewis, for example, goes through some of the core beliefs that just, in his opinion, have to exist in order for people to really understand truth. Jordan Peterson's one that talks a lot about these things. Religions obviously have things they teach are absolutes, but even religion to religion, there's disagreement. But part of that is, when I say you have to be slightly open, is there is no way that you have 100% true beliefs in our world here. And that's why we have to be somewhat open to say, how do we strike this balance of saying, hold on to some of your core beliefs, but you've got to allow some flexibility and change in other things in order to truly find truth. And that's a very difficult walk. And it's one that I think we don't always do well. Some people will say, I was raised in a religion, told all these things were absolutely true, and then I discovered something that was outside that paradigm that had been created, so now they throw away the whole paradigm because it was kind of an absolutist position. And if it's absolutist, and you discover one thing outside the paradigm, or the paradigm counter, people throw away the whole paradigm. And then we're in this really confusing place, and I feel that's one thing that's happening too in our world is there's so many experiences coming together now, so many people that can say, that's not my paradigm, and they can show us something outside of it, that people are starting to discard their whole paradigm. And I think instead we have to teach this balance of, well, there are some absolutes and some things, but we have to be willing to be open to totally different things than we expected or maybe believed were even possible, because we're starting to find more and more of it. And these experiences come up.
I was just thinking that sometimes we feel like maybe we're this unique generation of a lot of information. Like in the Bible, when Christ was spoken to, the really smart attorneys or lawyers or Pharisees and stuff came to him and said, what's the greatest commandment in the law? Because there was so much there, right, that they had to sort through and discern. But Christ was able to come down and say it was, number 1 and number 2, and to clarify those two things as absolute truths, right? It didn't mean that the other things weren't important, but he was able to say, like, here's your number one and here's your number two. And I think that is a value of religion, is knowing, like, looking at every case, so maybe we're not so unique as a people, and this has been a time that we still have the same opportunity to find answers to kind of look at it, and maybe from that framework of what's number one and number two, and logistics of what's right, but like, yeah, it's hard to find it, but and this is a unique scenario we're necessarily in.
Personal revelation, that's it.
So personal revelation, some
But
people
I
believe in
like your
that.
definitions, because that's conflict, that's not aggressive, like, how do you explain that? What's your definition of that? When you're asking questions to learn and to seek
Yeah.
knowledge, then you can actually have a conversation and learn where the differences is versus just hot and cold. You're finding the definition, and I feel like that's healthy. And I love that idea of finding a definition or seeking truth through, what does that mean to you? What is that? How do you define that? And I think that's a brilliant way to begin conversations that are difficult.
Yeah, just to open up and say, hey, teach me, where's your point of view? Because I don't understand right now. I don't agree with what you're saying, so help me understand where you're coming from. And people generally are very open to share
Yeah.
why they believe something, and we don't have to take it as, oh, I have to believe it now. But when Faylin was talking too, she was kind of saying, look, people have been searching for a long time to know the truth. The lawyers, they searched the law, they read all these ancient texts, there's so many of them, most people didn't get to read them, and they still had to say, so out of all these things, what's the greatest? And sometimes when we don't know something, when I don't know about the wars in, Israel and Russia and all these things, I can feel overwhelmed and go, oh, I don't know what to do. I don't feel I'll ever be able to do it. Or I can look at it as an opportunity to grow and say, there's still things for me to do in this life. There's still things to learn, to grow, and to be with. And so we can look at things as either crushing or an opportunity. And the same when we talk to people, if someone has an opposing viewpoint, and we say, this is an opportunity for me to learn. And we can learn from it. And that's one of the powers of the freedom of speech that we have.
Which is a very meek thing to do, because again, it's vulnerable to do that, because there's so many people with such strong opinions where